Well, in fact, in respect for everybody's time, let's go ahead and start. If Justice Gore may or may not be back, she stepped away for a second. There she is.
I'm back.
All right, great, thanks. All right, so I'll call the meeting to order. I don't know that we have any real introductions to do today. Jane, Dr. Venohr was with us at the last meeting, so let's just go ahead and jump in unless I'm missing someone need to recognize. All right. All right, so we want to start out just very quickly and take a few minutes. A point of personal privilege, certainly for Elaine and I and some others who had the honor and the privilege of working with Judge Louisa Abbott for a number of years. She shepherded the law through at times when many of us thought we could not get support on both sides of the aisle. And she did an amazing job for us. She still shares her thoughts with us. Even now, I will say that I'm not going to share them with anyone else because I don't know who she wants me to share them with, but she has a strong interest in shared parenting time, legitimation, all those sorts of things we have to be moving forward with, but particularly legitimation. She has some really good ideas on that, and maybe we can incorporate some of that going forward. And I'll talk more about that about legitimation at the end of the day. Whoops, I think I just got lost. Am I still there? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So, Elaine, why don't I give you an opportunity if you want to say some things about Judge Abbott. I would say that we begged her. We did everything we could to get her to be with us today. And she just doesn't like the spotlight. She doesn't do the things that she does for recognition, praise. She does it because she cares deeply about this work. And we just couldn't make it work. I'd say when she gave excuse after excuse, but they were all legitimate. And we told her we'd recognize her absence. So, Elaine, anything you want to say?
Oh, yes, sir. It really was an honor to work with her because I'd never met her before working. I was at the Division of Child Support Services at the time and had the opportunity to meet her. And she was just amazing because she chaired the Statute Review Subcommittee originally, and then eventually was the chair of the Child Support Commission. And she is really a hardworking judge. She kept us on our toes with everything that we were doing with statute review. Because we had to go through every piece of what was HB 221 that didn't have a table, didn't have a study, contract with Dr. Venohr and get that done, and then rewrite that bill into SB 382. So, she was a huge part of that work and was so diligent in all of her efforts and was just, a joy to work with. And so she was, she really has always been such an amazing judge. And over the years, I've been able to continue to talk with her and work with her on occasion for different things. And the bench is going to miss her when she's gone. Chatham County is going to miss her, but she certainly deserves this retirement. She's a hardworking lady.
She did. I served as chair of Statute Review Committee under her, and then eventually as vice chair. And I almost didn't take the offer to be chair of the commission because, like in sports, the first coach to follow a legend normally gets fired in a couple of years. And,
you weren't that lucky.
I know, and I knew I could not fill those shoes, and honestly made the decision up front. And I probably expressed it to some people that I can't do what she did. I mean, she checked every comma and period and semicolon and colon in every document that passed through this commission, and was knee deep in everything that was done. And I could not do that, and I could not come near matching what she did. But she was certainly great to me and taught so much to all of us. Does anyone else have anything they want to say about Judge Abbott?
Judge Key, I'll just take a moment in light of a segue to what we're about to talk about a little later in the agenda to say she was also a legislative charmer of the highest order. And Chairman Rich and Chairman Gaines may appreciate this, but the bill that she was tasked with changing, that Herculean effort to get everything up to speed, was Chairman Earl Earhart's bill that had already gone through a process and already been passed, and it then had to be changed wholesale. So I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? All right. Well, we're grateful for her work, and we'll make sure that we communicate to her how appreciative everyone is of her leadership in this work. All right, so we'll move on. Then I think next will be the minutes. We have distributed the minutes. Hope everyone's had an opportunity to read them. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, they will stand approved as submitted. All right, so we'll move next to Statute Review Committee. Co-chairs Katie, Connell, and Judge Williford.
Thank you, Judge Key. The Statute Review Committee met on September 22nd, and we have a couple things to bring to your attention. For my part, I would like to ask the commission for thoughts and direction as to whether whether the commission would like the Statute Review Committee to look into the changes in 19615 A12 brought about by the Life Act. There's been some reference to prenatal support. And it impacts 19615 and the definition of a child and who's eligible to receive support and how that will work. And the Statute Review Committee at this point has made note that that has come into effect, and that there is possibly some examination of the statute that needs to take place for that, but didn't want to move forward without putting it before the commission. So that's half the report from us, and then I'll let Judge Williford update the commission on the rest of our work.
Elaine, I know you've had some conversation with General Counsel DHS about this issue. Does DHS, as far as you know, believe there needs to be some changes in the child support statute around it?
The last information that we have for them is that not at the moment, they don't have an opinion at the moment as to making any kind of changes. So I think they're sitting back at this point. They've not updated us with any information. I know that Byron is with us, Byron Cuthbert. I can promote him to panelist for a moment. Byron, you'll have to accept that promote. And sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but Byron, can you tell us, is there any different? I don't want to speak for the agency without authority to do so.
You spoke properly.
Good.
We haven't changed our stance officially. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Byron. I'm going to unpromote you now.
Thank you.
And I'll just put this out to commission members. Does anyone believe that that's something we need to address? I've read the information about it. And does anyone think we need to make a change? In particular, our practitioners in the field. And I'll just toss it back, Katie, to you, because you've looked at it, you're in the field every day. What are your thoughts on it?
I think it might be fodder for some complex cases. I think the available law, both in the form of the statute and the common law, I think there's some law there. I think it could get a little confusing, but I also think it wouldn't be wholly inappropriate to honestly just see what happens and see what what, if anything, the appellate courts do with, because we have some 2007 revision to the child support guidelines case law that addresses the issue of prenatal care and child and reimbursement for expenses for prenatal care. So and nothing's ever expressly overturned that case law. So I think we do have some guidance in our law. It's just not in the form of the statute. And I think, like I said, I do not think it would be in any way irresponsible or any sort of like shirking of our duties to see how it plays out. We just have not seen much of this issue since we revised our child support guidelines, so wholly in 2007. So it's just been a number of years. I'm not saying there have been zero cases dealing with that issue since 2007, but certainly that wholesale change to our guidelines, made some of that case law less applicable than it is now, because the old case law dealt with not only maternal care and prenatal care, but also child expenses before a child support order was put into effect. And now our guidelines
recording in progress.
So I think I could make an argument either way, but I'm saying if the commission decided to see what happens and how it plays out, see if we get some case law to the appellate courts or any sort of request from the appellate courts for the statute to be amended, which we sometimes see from the appellate courts, as we know. I think that would be appropriate.
Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I would say we kick the can down the road a little bit and see what happens.
All right, so we'll stand ready to review anything that someone might put forward. And we would hope we'd have that opportunity even before something's put forward. But other than that, I think we'll stand pat on it. All right, thank you, Katie. Judge Wolf?
Right. And I will just say that for those of y'all who were not present for August 19th commission meeting, Miss Regina Quick moved the commission to request a resolution by the Georgia General Assembly creating either a joint legislative parenting time deviation study committee or such a study committee in each house. And that motion was seconded by a commission member, I believe Judge Lisa Colbert, and it passed unanimously by voice vote with no abstentions. And so I have been attempting to speak with the legislators, at least the legislators on the commission regarding this matter. And because of my busy schedule and theirs, we continue to play phone tag. But the only question I had for the commission today, as it relates to that resolution, is who does the commission want to ask to sponsor the resolution for a legislative study committee on parenting time? And I was hoping that maybe I could convince Senator Strickland and be able to recommend someone to y'all today, but I haven't been able to speak with him. But that's really what we need to deal with, is who should we ask to sponsor that resolution for a legislative study committee on parenting time? If anybody has any connections, any advice, any opinions, I'd like to hear from the commission members on that.
We have two legislators with us today, and I don't know if they have any thoughts. I know less about the legislative process than many of you do. So do either of our representatives have any thoughts on the matter?
I don't have any, well, I'm not going to be there, so I can't do it for you.
Which is why I didn't reach out to you. I'm
be
sorry.
happy to otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do you want it to be a lawyer?
Well, and that's why I had Senator Strickland in mind, because of his work in the family law arena, the fact that he's not only an attorney, but he is a family law attorney, I thought would be very helpful. This is a pretty complex situation we're talking about, and trying to educate, especially non-lawyers, about why we need a parenting time adjustment and all of the ins and outs of that. It may need to be a lawyer. I'm not suggesting it has to be, but that would probably be the best idea. But we could certainly educate any legislative member who is not educated in the matter. We could certainly take the time to do that.
Regina, do you have any thoughts?
I think Senator Strickland's certainly a good choice. If there are no committee changes on the House side, the resolution might also go to Chairman Ballinger's committee if she retains that chairmanship. So my only suggestion would be if you'd like, I'm happy to reach out to her as well, and also join Judge Williford in trying to reach Senator Strickland, so that we can just secure one of them or a recommendation from the folks to whom the bills will be assigned. Those committees, it would be assigned most likely.
I'll be happy to help, in the House where I can. I'm not a lawyer, but definitely happy to assist in any way that I can, and whether it's recommendations with the appropriate folks or whatever it may be, I'm happy to assist.
Well, I appreciate that. Katie, I know that you were able to obtain a cell phone number for Senator Strickland. Did you ever make contact with him about this issue?
We have been playing phone tag. I can pass along his cell phone to you too, and maybe we can double team him.
Okay.
I know he's busy. I mean,
he did. I mean, in fairness to him, he sent me 2 available times and slots earlier this week. And I was I was at the conference on the Commission for Family, not for family violence, nobody's for family violence, I hope, on family violence. And so I was not able to reach him, so it's certainly not his fault, but we're still attempting to do that. And so I guess I'll just say we're still working on that. And Representative Gaines, I may be in touch with you too to try to explain to you what we're trying to do. And then Regina, I'll reach out to you too about your suggestions of who you might contact.
Sounds good.
Okay. Is
It's,
it okay with the commission members then if I just continue on that in that vein, trying to figure out who it needs to be and how it needs to be done, and then I can report back to y'all. It may be that I just report back to y'all in an email.
Yeah, I don't think this is an action item. It's just informational for anyone to share any ideas they might have.
Okay.
As chair, I would like to leave that in the hands of the people that know what they're doing.
Okay.
Let
All
you
right.
guys who are working on it, continue working on it. And we've had Regina and Representative Gaines offer assistance as well. So,
All right. I'll
Thank
keep
you.
y'all posted then. Thank you.
Thank
I
you
have
for
to
that.
sign a warrant, so I'm gonna hop off for just a second and I'll be right back.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll move next then to Technology and Calculator Subcommittee. Regina?
Yes, just very quickly, Judge Key, I appreciate the e-vote that we took on the motion that had been made about the calculator update to allow the deletion of expired and shared worksheets. And I just will report that staff is working with IT on that change. And I appreciate the additional time that e-vote has allowed us to work on that and has allowed IT to work on that. We have 2 meeting dates scheduled between now and the end of the year, really sort of preemptive, if you will, or waiting and seeing if there's making sure there's something on the books in case we need to take action, specific action, as a result of other things the commission might decide between now and the end of the year. But otherwise, Ms. Johnson and I are going to meet with staff over the IT over the next couple of weeks and just explore some of the ideas that have been floating around the Technology and Calculator Subcommittee. But you have handled our substantive business on August 19th, and for that, we're grateful.
All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, so we'll move next then to Economic Subcommittee, Dr. Tutterow. Okay.
Sorry, I apologize up front. I'm fighting laryngitis, so
Oh, gosh.
I don't feel that bad. I just sound terrible. So if y'all will bear with me, hopefully everyone can understand my voice. So since we met on the 19th of August, Dr. Venohr, who's joining us today, prepared the final report for the Economic Study Committee. The copy of the report was furnished to the commission members. Our Economic Subcommittee will meet on Wednesday, October the 19th at 1:30 to look at the findings in the report and bring back feedback to the total commission with regard to issues related to the establishment of the tables. So it's my honor at this time to introduce Dr. Jane Venohr from the Center of Policy Research in Denver to provide the commission with her final report on Georgia's 2022 economic study.
Thank
If you will, commission members can provide comments or directly to her after the presentation. Thanks.
Dr. Venohr, thank you for being here. This is your time.
Thank you, Dr. Tutterow, and thank you, the commission members. And I realize that last time we went through a lot and you were a great audience. And what we're going to do is slow it down a little bit today. And we're going to use that same PowerPoint and just focus on the economic. And we appreciate that the Economic Subcommittee, Georgia's unique in that you have a subcommittee that actually vets these issues separately, but because the federal reg is the federal requirement is to review the economic studies of child rearing costs, we're going to make sure that Georgia dots those I's and crosses those T's and go through it all for the commission. And then of course, under Dr. Tutterow's leadership, the subcommittee will vet more of what we say. So if it feels a little too detailed, you're in good hands. So we're going to start with slide 20 from the August presentation. And this is just to cover the economic analysis of the cost of raising children. And one thing that you're going to walk away realizing is that it's not just the economic data and how much it costs to raise children. There's lots of other factors such as Georgia's payroll taxes, and whether prices, we all have experienced inflation in the last few years. So if we look at slide 21, which is the next one, this is just at the core of the child support guidelines formula is the table. And this is based on a 2001 study of child rearing expenditures. The date gets a little fuzzy depending on when it was drafted and when it was finalized. And it was based on expenditures data that was collected from families surveyed in 96, 99. And it was updated to 2005 price levels. And obviously we've had a lot of inflation since then. The price levels have increased by 49%, but that doesn't mean a 49% increase in the table amounts because incomes have also increased. And so there's some somewhat of a shifting, but it's not a perfect shifting because obviously expenditures bundles have changed, where more households have internet and cell phones, and we've there's constantly a change in what our expenditures bundles are. And that current schedule, it considers federal and state income taxes in 2005. And that's important because when we make expenditures as consumers, we start from what we have as after-tax income, not our gross income. So, and we'll go through some of those other factors more so in a minute, but we're going to start with just at the core of this is what study of child rearing costs we use. And that's on slide 22, is that there's a bunch of studies out there. There's 10 studies to be specific that form the basis of state guidelines. These studies vary in their data years and their methodology. A methodology is needed to separate the child share of expenditures from total expenditures, and economists don't agree on which methodology best estimates actual child rearing expenditures. Where today most states are falling is most 31 states use what we call the Rothbarth methodology, which looks at expenditures in two sets of households, one with children, one without children. It deems them equally well off using their expenditures on adult goods, which is defined as adult clothing. That makes an adjustment to account for some families with older children buying adult clothing for their teenage children. And that difference in their expenditures between those with children and those without children is deemed to be child rearing expenditures. And the other methodology, actually, the Georgia schedule right now, or the table, is based on the average of the Rothbarth and the average of the Engel. And Engel is a close cousin to the Rothbarth in that the sense that it uses expenditures in between those with and without children, only it uses food shares to denote whether they're equally well off. And a challenge for Georgia, the last few reviews since Georgia adopted this, this average approach, is that there hasn't been a new Engel study. And so that was part of the charge of our contract was Betson was contracted to use Engel estimates based on the most recent expenditure survey, which is 2013, 2019. And he's been updating the Rothbarth. And so now we have something that can be a comparison of apples to apples versus apples to oranges. Since there's only been 3 new studies since Georgia released last review. There's the BR5, what we call, which is the Betson Rothbarth, the 5th study, and that was released in 2021. It's already been adopted by 6 states. There's the Betson Engel that was created under this project. And then Florida State did also both a Betson Engel and Betson Rothbarth right at about the same time we were getting into this contract with Georgia. So we didn't have all the data at that time from Florida. It was released toward the end or early this year. And they used both the Betson Engel, the Engel and the Rothbarth, and they actually came out with similar results. And I will say that historically, what we've done is, or what most states have done under the encouragement of an economic report that was done for the federal government in 1990, is do a bracket approach, that we look at the lowest study and the highest study. And if a state amount falls in between, then it's probably about right as far as how much it costs to raise children. So moving on to the next slide, which is slide 23, all these studies that I'm talking about, they all rely on the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's probably one of the most robust, rigorous surveys out there in the world, I would say. And they survey about 5,000 households each quarter on hundreds of items. Each household stays in there for about 4 quarters. It's not state specific. They do region specific, Northeast, South, Midwest, and West. And they are just starting to do states for the top 5, and Georgia just missed the cut as far as on the population size. I think if I remember off the top of my head, Georgia's ranked like 6 or 8, somewhere around there, and population size. And Dr. Tutterow might know that off the top of his head. But the primary purpose of the survey is it's used to calibrate how we measure changes in price levels, but it also has a lot of detail on expenditures in households with and without children. And they're constantly improving the survey. And they do both a diary and they do also a phone survey, and they compare them to make sure that the results are all in a line, and they're always refining it. And sometimes those refinements to the survey actually affect those measurements of child rearing expenditures that I'm going to show you in a minute. So on slide 24, the first study I'm going to talk about is the Betts and Rothbard study, because that's the other half to what forms the basis of the existing Georgia guidelines table. And you'll see the red is what the study year was, is the study that was used to formulate the Georgia schedule. And then the white is the most, so if you look toward the left, is the most recent study. And if you look at the one child amount, it's been pretty stable, just around 25%. And remember, there's always a sampling error, that if we were to sample some of you all right now, let's say that we sampled 10 people that are on this Zoom call, and then we picked another random sample of 10 people, and we might get some of the same people, but we probably won't. Your results of the survey are going to be different, or your results. So there's all some sampling error. So whether that difference, which it shows a little bit of a reduction, is a sampling error or if it's real, we don't know. What we do know is that the expenditures on households with more children appear to be increasing. And our theory on that, and which other economists that are estimating this, which includes the Florida State University and Rutgers, or maybe it's just the Rutgers one. I think it's just the Rutgers one. I'm not sure I saw it in the Florida study, is that economies of scale that we know about having more children, it's diminishing. That it used to be that, if you had another child, you might have the child share the bedroom, the other children. So you had economies of scale that the second child doesn't cost as much as the first child. It used to be that it was pretty much half as much, but now we're having more individualization, obviously, of child rearing expenditures. So we believe that trend that we're seeing that's increasing for 2 and 3 children is correct, that we're losing some of that economies of scale. And when you look at the schedule, what you're going to see is that the increases are much more significant than they are for one child. And that might, and we believe that explains it. So then when you go on to the next slide, which is slide 25, and this is the other half, the Ingle study, we have some problems here. And what you'll see is that there's a decrease. The red line, the red right there, is what was used. And it doesn't mean that it was a good study. It's a great study. What was used at the time was the best out there. And what has happened with the studies using the Engel approach since then is that there shows a decrease. And it appears, based on the analysis that is appended to the economic report, is that that change concurs with when the Bureau of Labor Statistics changed how they were capturing food data on food away from home, how they were measuring food, that when they changed that question, all of a sudden the Engel estimates started getting lower. And it was, it has to do with the question on food at home. And for some reason, when they, the households without children, their food expenditures bumped up a lot. And ever since that data year change, that we saw the Engel plummet. And we do believe that this is an artifact of the way that the change in the Bureau of Labor Statistics now measures food. It does not mean at all that the study was invalid before, that those were credible studies. There's just constantly a change. And part of it is societal, that, you know, of course, more people more people are buying food away from home, particularly than they were back in the 90s. And that we also know that, expenditures on food away from home is differ from those with childless and child couples. So there is some problems with the latest Engel estimates. And we also notice when Betson was running the numbers that it's sensitive, and what that means is if you use a slightly different population, like the population that has expenditures on adult clothing, it comes out with a different result. And what we want statistically is a stable estimate, that if we change that population slightly, like when I was saying that we polled 10 of you, take a random sample of 10 of you, and then we take another random sample of 10, we should be able to statistically get about the same result. And actually it should be even a higher number, because 10's not gonna, that's not the sample size that is what we usually rely on for a credible sample size as far as statistical analysis. You know, usually we want at least 30. So for that, but so the short of it is that we do have some Engel estimates, but the measurements, there's some issues with it, and it's been confirmed by the Florida study as well. And so, but moving on, I want to skip to slide 26. And the reason being is I want to stick to the schedule, because I want to go through all the different assumptions every time, and I know that Georgia is fortunate to have an economic subgroup that will review these assumptions, but it's also an opportunity for the commission to review it and to do due diligence to respect to the spirit of the federal requirement to review the economic data on the cost of raising children, and for the state to determine whether it's appropriate to make adjustments on that. It's good to know all the factors that are considered in that table. And those 9 factors are the guidelines model, obviously the income shares model. The income shares model presumes that the child is entitled to the amount of expenditures the child would have received in an intact family. And so that's why we start with economic estimates of child rearing expenditures in intact families. That is an assumption made by the state of Georgia, and that's, Georgia's assumption to decide what they want to do. The economic study to use and the underlying consumer expenditure surveys data is also that's a prerogative. There's lots of studies out there. So there's merits and limitations to each of those studies available. Obviously, one merit that is obvious is the more recent data is a good thing. To have more recent consumer expenditure data is always a good thing. The third factor is the price levels. And, Georgia is based on 2005 price levels. And as I mentioned before, we've seen a 49% increase in price levels, but we also have seen incomes increase, which have partially offset that. We have to exclude childcare expenses, health insurance premiums, and extraordinary healthcare costs, out-of-pocket healthcare costs from that table. We do that because the actual amount expended on those costs is dealt with in the guidelines on a case-by-case basis because it's highly variable. Obviously, for families, though, we heard this in the pandemic that childcare expenses increased. And so we're going to see some changes in those. We have to do some adjustments to those raw data that I showed you to account for those childcare and health insurance, because sometimes families, what they do is they don't, just because their childcare expenses go up, it doesn't mean that they can afford it. They might spend less on food, they might spend less on clothing, etc. So one thing we haven't talked about in the past, but I'm going to bring up because a lot of the neighboring states do it, is number 5, is that adjust for Georgia's lower prices, cost of living. It's very slightly different, and I'll show you some data on that in a minute. Then we have to relate those expenditures to after-tax income, because when economists such as Professor Betson measure child rearing expenditures, they measure it as a percent of total expenditures. You can't measure it as a percent of income because that would violate some statistical assumptions. So we have to convert it to after-tax income, and then we have to relate it back to gross income to come up with a gross income schedule. And most states base their guidelines on gross income. It's a cleaner cut measure for those that practice. You're all aware that it's easier sometimes to work with gross income than after-tax income because many households have variations in their taxes and what they claim. And then we extend we can extend the table to the highest income considered. And with the new economic data, we can take that schedule or that table from 30,000 combined income to 40,000. Whether that matters from the case file data that we showed you last time, only 1% of the case file data had incomes greater than 30,000. So it's not really going to hit that many. And we also saw that those higher incomes are the ones that are more likely to deviate. So they're not even, to be honest, the ones at the very high income rung, they deviated in every case. So they're not even using that high end of the schedule. And then the optional one that I'm bringing up because a lot of the states neighboring Georgia do this as a consideration of the parent's basic subsistence needs. That's now a federal requirement. Georgia meets it through its deviation criteria. And but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the options. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of a refresher on these each of these factors. And again, we realize that you have unlike other states, you have a subgroup that will be meeting soon. So this next one just shows just the economic data, a little bit more on the economic data. And this is slide 20. Oops, I'm sorry. I'm jumping here and I didn't tell Noeletta where I'm going. We're going to slide 38. Okay, so there's 41 states that use the income shares model, and probably a criticism of that is that, well, we're seeing increase in never marrieds, and why start with the assumption that we have expenditures in intact families? Well, you can go to the USDA, and that's in their report. You can look at, if we look at low income couples that are single parents, and we look at low income couples that are married couples, they actually spend the same dollar amount on children. There isn't a differential. So that whole notion of, well, it would make a difference in the schedule, it wouldn't. Where it would make a difference is that we don't have a lot of high income single parents. We don't have many that earn 70,000. So we wouldn't have as much data for those higher incomes if we were to use single parent families. So if we talked about the economics, so I'm going to skip to slide 39, which is the price levels. And I've already stated this a couple times that there's been a 49% increase, and there's actually been more. When we did this presentation in August, the most current price levels available were from July 2020. So those schedules that you saw in those side-by-side comparisons that we provided back in August, they were using July 22 price levels. So we could move on to the next slide, which is factor 4, taking out the childcare and then most of the child's healthcare needs. We keep $250 per child per year. And what you'll see here is we use the Betts and Rothbarth to illustrate this point. And if you look at the solid lines, these are those estimates of child rearing expenditures for a range of income before we pull out the child care and most of the child's health care costs. When we pull out the child care and most of the child's health care costs, we end up on the dotted lines. And what you'll see here is that it's not a uniform change, that you would think that if everybody had the same child care and healthcare costs, that the distance between the solid line and the dashed line would be the same. But it's not, and that's because of subsidies, to be honest. You know, like if they're low income, they're probably getting childcare subsidies. And if they're low income, they're probably getting Medicaid, which doesn't have any co-pays. The takeaway message for this is that one thing that we hear a lot is, why can't we just take that schedule and increase it by 10%, you know, across the board, and say there, you know, if there was like a 10% increase in prices. Well, we know from looking at this that there's an unequal change, partially due to some households having more or less childcare expenses out of pocket, or more or less medical expenses out of pocket. And it also speaks to, you know, you can do an alternative assumption about how much medical expenses are included in there. Ideally, I would say that it would be ideal to have a lower amount for those that are Medicaid and those that aren't Medicaid, because we also see that those of higher income are incurring higher deductibles and higher out of pocket, and makes your guidelines much more complicated to calculate. So moving on to the next slide, slide 41. And this is, and the reason Georgia is not adjusted for Georgia's specific income or price levels. And we have been using price parity lately to adjust for some states, although Alabama and South Carolina don't use price parity. They actually use a realignment to income. So there's only 2 states surrounding Georgia that do a differential just because they have lower prices or low income, and that's Alabama. And you can see Georgia is at 94.5%. So that means that Georgia prices are about 5.5% less. That's for the whole state. It's probably, I didn't pull the Atlanta or some of the urban areas. And there's some question whether price parity actually is measured by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, whether it actually captures regional differences in housing prices correctly. For Alabama, it's 89.3. They make an adjustment. Florida doesn't make an adjustment. North Carolina doesn't make an adjustment. And South Carolina does make an adjustment. And their price parity is 91.6. Tennessee also doesn't it. So when we move on to slide 42, and I'll take a break here in a minute before we do the comparisons, I did mention that the all economists that use a marginal cost approach, which is both the Engel and the Rothbard, they measure child rearing expenditures as a percentage of total expenditures. So we have to convert it first to net income, and then we convert it to gross income. And it gets a little tricky with the low income because they spend on average more than their income. And that's what's shown by that orange line there. And this contributes to some of the decreases that we see at low income, is that we cap it. And this is an assumption that we made in developing the 2005 schedule as well, is that we assume that, see that line that says after tax income, we lop that right off on the expenditures on children. And this was a premise that's probably wasn't, it's in the documentation of the 2005 schedule. And what that means is that for those families that spend more of their income, we're actually seeing a lower amount just to account for them spending more. And that's going to affect households right around those incomes of about 4,500, 4,500 gross combined income per month, which is where you're going to see some decreases in the schedule amount. So this is, if people are concerned about any decreases in those side-by-side comparisons, eliminating this assumption, which is an assumption that we included in the 2005, is something to ponder. With the higher income, the middle, they actually have some taxes and savings. And I didn't put the taxes actually in the other side of that. And there's some states that just assume that because it costs more to raise a child in separated households, that they just take that whole percentage, that blue box, as a percentage of income or percentage of total expenditures, and apply that to everything, ignore the savings. And what that does is bump up the child support table. So then when we get to factor 7, which is on slide 43, that's when we convert it from net to gross income. And the existing table was used 2005 withholding formulas for a single taxpayer. So we switched that out to 2022 and still use a single taxpayer. And what that does is there's been a little bit of increase, particularly at high incomes, and that explains some of the increases. So it's not just the economic data that has changed for the high incomes, but they have more after-tax income. So that explains some of the increases that we'll see at high incomes. So the factor 8, which is slide 44, is that I mentioned this earlier, that that the new data allows us to go up to 40,000 instead of 30,000. So now what I like to do is, now that you know all the factors that went into it, I like to backtrack and look at where this lands. And any questions before I start putting that up?
James, Roger, a couple points of clarification, please. On the factor 9, you said was optional, was that you could have a maintenance for a parent, right? I'm sorry, my voice is so bad I can't speak.
Oh, I skipped the low income adjustment, didn't I?
Well, the 0.9, that's right. And I mean, I wanted to clarify which, when we talk, if you go back to the original slide that had the 9 factors on it.
Yeah, let's go back to that. And I'd like to do the low income because that explains the state. Yeah. So it would be
Okay, so 9, provide for consideration of the parent's basic subsistent needs. Let's clarify for everyone, which we're talking custodial parent, non-custodial, both.
The way it's written in the federal reg is that states are to consider this basic subsistence needs of the obligated parent. Actually, they use the term non-custodial parent, and at the state's discretion, the custodial parent.
Okay.
And Noletta's doing a wonderful job. Noletta, before I do the state comparisons, I don't know why I skipped factor 9. I want to do that because it's important to understand why Georgia's difference is so different than other states, because we're going to show other states. So if we go to slide 45 for a minute.
Absolutely.
And this is the federal reg verbatim. And I'm sorry, Professor Tutterow, did you say you had another point besides the issue with factor 9?
Go ahead, and then I was going to come back for clarification on inflation.
Okay.
Thanks.
So the reason that we brought this up is, obviously this federal regulation was adopted in 2016. Georgia meets it. Okay, there's not an issue with there. It's just Georgia now is one of 3 states that does not have a presumptive low income adjustment. And that's one of the reasons that you formulated a work group to improve, and to improve the instructions layout of the low income deviation factor. And the conclusion was that to wait for the 2020 quadrennial review that was looking at the table, and the table amounts is what I pulled from there. And I just want to show you briefly what 2-year neighboring states do, and this will help when we go back to the comparisons. The comparisons are going to show what an updated average would look like, an updated Rothbarth, and how you compare to other states look like. So I wanted to show you what your other states do first. And page 46, the next slide, shows what Alabama does. And so in this scenario, what Alabama does, so we have 2 parents, and in this case, the plaintiff is the obligated parent, and I'm going to use statistically he, because 80% are he's and not, obviously some are going to be female. It's $1,200, and then the custodial parent is $1,000. Their combined income is $2,200. And then it just like Georgia, they pull the basic obligation on line 4 from their table. And then the plaintiff has 55% of the combined income. The defendant has 45% of the combined income. So line 5 shows their prorated amount, which each parent is deemed responsible for, and those joint child rearing expenditures. And then we get to line 6, which is the self-support test. And this is something that Alabama uses, and they decided on a self-support reserve of $981. And that 981 was the federal poverty level in 2021 multiplied by the ratio of Alabama's median family income divided by the US family income. And the reason being is because Alabama, their advisory committee, which is the Supreme Court advisory committee, because their guidelines are set in court rule, they felt like they should have a low income. They're considered one of the 10 lowest income states in the country. And so they did an adjustment for their whole table, their whole schedule. So they thought what's good for the whole table should be done for the self-support reserve as well. So that's why they took that federal poverty level and multiplied it by an adjustment that accounts for Alabama's lower income. So what they do is they take that 1,200 and they minus that 981, which was a policy decision, what to set that self-support reserve at. And that's how Alabama did it. The highest self-support reserve is 150% of the poverty level, and it's applied to net income, and that's used by New Jersey. So that's close to 1,700 right now. I don't think that would be appropriate for Georgia economically, but at the end of the day, that's a policy decision. So the difference between that is 219, and that's on line 6. And then line 7, they take 85% of that. And what that implies is that they recognize that this is gross income, and obviously that parent is going to have some taxes. They're going to have some payroll taxes, and payroll taxes right about there are 15%. Actually, they're closer to 10-12% right at that level. And so it provides some economic incentive for the obligated parent to increase earnings, because if we were to take every dollar above gross income, there wouldn't be any economic incentive. And then line 8 is that we look at the difference between line 5, which was the regular calculation, and then the line 7, and we take the lower amount. So that's the way Alabama does it. That's the way West Virginia does it. Now, you can also have the advantage of this too, is that you can see on line 6, you can put a self-support reserve for the defendant too, which would be the custodial parent. So you're treating both parents equally. The question with that is, well, okay, so, New Jersey has a provision that you can't apply this low income adjustment unless the custodial household's income is over 105, I think it's 105% of the poverty level. Well, what that means is that it's rarely applied, because usually if one's applied, one's low income, the other parent's low income, and it kind of defeats the purpose. And that's an issue, particularly when it's a TANF case, because it sounds good. It sounds like, oh yes, we're protecting the custodial parent. The custodial parent household has income below poverty, and the obligated parent shouldn't get a break because they have below poverty. Well, if they're on TANF, that money's actually going to the state if they're getting cash TANF. So that's a counter argument. I mean, and it just underscores there's a lot of difficult policy issues in formulating a low income adjustment. So the next slide, which is 47, and just briefly, and then we can go to the impact, but I just wanted to show you these to help you understand why, when we do the state comparisons, why these states look so different. This is North Carolina, and they do that same concept of the self-support reserve, only they incorporate it right into the schedule. The advantage of it is, like, you could just see it. It's the shaded area of the blue. Obviously, you know, on that first line where the income is $1150, so you can picture a case where there's an obligated parent that has $1150 in income, and then the custodial parent has no income. Obviously, that first row is $50, and that's not how much it costs to raise a child. So everything in blue, that shaded blue, has been downward adjusted to account for a self-support reserve. And it's just not as transparent as Alabama's method of doing it. Like in Alabama, you saw exactly what the self-support reserve, you saw exactly the incentive for the economic incentive to earn more by taking the 85%. Here, it's all kind of hidden behind the scenes. But the advantage is that you see it all in one place, and you don't have to do the worksheet calculation to get there. So there's strengths and weaknesses to each approach. And so what you also see here, you know, is, you know, minimum wage, federal minimum wage right now is $7.25 an hour. And so a obligated parent with full-time minimum wage earnings would be $1,257. So you see in North Carolina, because of their self-support reserve, that order is going to be $101. And that's important when we do the state comparisons, to kind of hold on to why we're going to see a difference. And I will say that $50 is a minimum order. That's at state discretion, whether you want a minimum order. You can set, some states believe in that. Some also states are going to having a zero order for incarcerated parents or those that are incapacitated for various reasons. I'm seeing a demise in just like the concept of a minimum order. So before we do look at the comparisons of all the numbers, Dr. Tutterow, you mentioned that you had another question.
No, just a point of clarification. When we talk about the inflation, and for example, being up 49% since 2005, I guess was what you cited. I mean, it's important that we don't want to, I would not want to say we get a partial offset on income and wages, because it's unclear that's the case. I mean, it could be a complete offset in some cases. I mean, if you look at average hourly earnings adjusted for inflation, they're up slightly over the last 15 years. So my point is, for the audience that are not necessarily on the commission, the inflation effects, just a pure inflation of wages going up and prices going up pretty close to in lockstep, does not cause drastic changes in the table. It's the change in the composition of how we spend the money and how we measure that. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. I will say that we are seeing some larger increases, not in Georgia, at the lower runs, and that's partially due to most states have increased their minimum wage.
Right.
So their incomes have increased. And who knows, that might put some pressure on some of the lower wage occupations in Georgia too, to bring up their wages. I can't speak to that. You probably can more so.
Jane, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Elaine. You have 10 minutes left in your time slot.
Okay, sweet.
I just wanted to remind you of that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so slide 27. And this is what we're looking at. So the red is existing, the updated is the average, and it's kind of hidden in that one child amount. And then the updated, we just use the Rothbarth. And I will remind you that Georgia is the only state to use an updated angle. Most states use the Rothbarth, and it doesn't, I mean, there's the angle methodology is good. There's other states that use the angle methodology still, but it's a much older study. Florida uses an angle study from 72, 73. And as you remember, right, we saw what I thought was some sampling differences. So you see, what you see here is that it's pretty darn close at the lower incomes. And actually some of the amounts on either the updated Rothbarth or the average would be less for one child, below about 20,000. But then when we get above there, it's all as clearly more, no matter what study you use. And I also show the USDA, that's another barometer. It's the top line. And if you look at it, we did blow it up just to look at the differences for one child. And this is probably where, you know, there's like, okay, what's going on here? Because the 2 children and the 3 children amounts are going to be much more sensible. But remember that we saw that only a little change in that one child amount, and that might be explaining the patterns that we see in one child where you don't see it in 2 and 3. As we move to slide 28, what we see here is we look at the differences. You see that the average difference for one child again, and there's some things that are happening here, obviously, with the one child, is that there's actually an average decrease using the average of $10, and that's at the lower runs of the income. But if we use the Rothbarth, then it's an average increase of $106. I also we have several states, most of our states that are updating their guidelines, or we're already on the Rothbarth estimates. And so they've asked us to do no decreases, recognizing that inflation is increasing so much that, I mean, sometimes for some states, I run a schedule in January, and by July, any sort of decrease that we're seeing for that little, which could be a sampling error for one child, goes away. And you'll see that the minimum or the biggest decrease under the Rothbarth is $59, but for the 2 children, it's $30. So some states have been asking me just to keep the existing amount where there was decreases, just because they know it takes like a year later after they've made the commission recommendation for any sort of changes, and they're anticipating inflation to go to continue. Now, if you look at the 2 child boxes, you're going to see that there's an increase. And what you would think is that, you know, that whole economies of scale that I was talking about, that we're seeing that it was expenditures on 2 and 3 children are increasing. It might be that those are the more stable ones, and that there's some decreases for the 1 child one. You know, we don't have the data to definitively say that. But if you look at slide 29, you'll see that the only places that we see decreases, if you're using the updated averages, for incomes below about 5,000. So those are going to be the low income earners by the time you think about the combined income. The same with 3 child. When we get to 4, 5, 6 children, what we do is we don't have enough data in the CE, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, so we use multipliers. So the patterns for 4 or 5 children are about the same. I mean, excuse me, the patterns for, the 3 child are the same for 4 or 5, 6 children. And let's see, there was another point I wanted to make, but we'll just go on from there. So let's go to the case scenarios and move this up a little bit. We're doing a bunch of case scenarios, and I'll explain them in a bit. And you can look at the other states. The next slide is just a comparison of the state guidelines. This is probably the most fun one to look at on your own to see how you compare. And you can see that Georgia is the minority of states where they have a deviation for their low income adjustment, where everybody else has a rebuttable presumption, and this just provides details. If we move to slide 33, this is where the rubber meets the road. And that first case scenario, those first 2 case scenarios are kind of common. What we saw in the case file data last time, that we have, either an obligor that earned with the minimum wage, $12.57, and a lot of times it's imputed, or we have it imputed to both parents. And you can see that the existing amount for the one child amount is $416 for that scenario. If using the pure Rothbarth, and because of that little decrease there, it's $393. It's not enough to meet Georgia's modification threshold, which is 15% and at least a $25 change. And actually, none of these changes are probably enough that big until we get to the higher incomes than they would be, and those are the households that are deviating. But what you'll really see is that, look at the other states, that they, in this situation, because of Georgia's, and the Georgia deviation wouldn't apply because they're not below poverty, or I guess there would be still judicial discretion there, that Georgia is still higher. It doesn't matter if you use your existing, if you retain your existing schedule, if you were to adopt one based on the Rothbarth, you were to adopt on the average, it's still higher than most of your neighboring states because of that low income adjustment that most states do. When you get to case 4, we have slightly higher income because I took the median earnings for based on census data on what Georgia workers earn with less than a high school education. Actually, I skipped case 3. That's the $10 an hour. And when we get to case 4, that's when we start seeing some different earnings, but you'll see that they're very, very close. When you get to the higher earnings, there's very small decreases. The decrease is never more than $33 because of this new economic data, and also might be because of that cap we imposed on those that are spending more on their income. And so the low income adjustment applies to cases 1 and 2 in Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And I guess I had that on the screen. I just couldn't see it the way I have it. So let's move on to 33, and we'll just keep moving real fast. We're almost done. And here, these are the 2 child amounts. Again, you see some small decreases for 1 to 3 children. It's never more than $23. And so it's never more than 15% or 25 and $25, which is the modification threshold. But you'll see that Georgia amounts are much higher than those of neighboring states, even right now, if you were to retain that the way that you do it now, you know, so it's some food for thought on what to do. And now if we move to the case, slide 34, which shows for the 3 child, and again, about 80% of your cases, I think it's actually 90% of your cases, I have the number somewhere in this pile, are going to be for 1 and 2 children. But the difference is never more, if you were to go to the average or even the Rothbarth, the difference is never more than $8. So again, it's not significant. Now, when you get to slides 35, we're looking at the higher incomes. And then this is where you're going to see predominantly increases. When you get to the higher incomes, and again, you know, we know that the 1 child amounts are lower, and it might be that sampling error that we have going on. And then when we get to more income, you know, we also have those other factors. For instance, the change to the tax code in 2008, which caused higher incomes to have more after tax income than lower incomes. We also have that episode with inflation. And since that's a multiplier, you know, if we take 10% increase of $1, that's 10 cents. But if we take, you know, a 10% increase of $10,000, it's much more significant. So these other factors kind of compound what those increases that we're seeing at higher incomes. And when we get to the 2 child amounts at page 36, we'll even see that updating the schedule, regardless of whether you're using whether you're using average or the Rothbarth, it's a pretty significant increase. Like if you do that highest case scenario where we're considering a combined income of $25,000 a month, it would go from $1,730, the schedule amount, to 2073 using the Rothbarth alone, but it would increase to 1934 using the average. And that is still not 15% of a change. And some states use that as a barometer to whether they should change their table. If it's not enough to do a threshold, meet what they use for a modification. I mean, just to put that out there. The other thing that I want to say is that we also know from the case file review that 25,000 case, that's going to be more likely a case that's going to have a deviation. Like I mentioned before, those higher incomes, they're more likely to have deviations. So slide 37 just kind of shows the same patterns for 3 children, that we see some significant increases using even the average of the Rothbarth and the Engel, or even just using the Rothbarth when we get to higher incomes. So how am I doing with time? I think I did it. Did I, for a change?
You are about 2 or 3 minutes over, so you did really well on time. I'm very, very pleased, Jay. And of course, they're going to be, the members may have questions, so they'll still engage you. So hang on. So Judge Key is going to, thank you for that presentation, Jane, and Judge Key is going to take us into our question and discussion segment. Judge Key, you'll have to unmute.
I don't want to hear my dogs barking. So are there any comments, concerns, questions, or recommended edits to the economic study report? I know there's a lot of material there. Dr. Tutterow?
Yeah, I guess I would just, again, thank you, Jane, for your hard work. We spent a lot of time back in 2005 or 6 wrestling with balancing out the higher, at that time, Engel was higher than Rothbarth, and we had hoped we thought we had reached a good balancing at that point. Obviously, your analysis shows that Engel has maybe deteriorated is not the right word, but has changed in a manner to where it calls into question whether we can stick with that position or whether we want to go with current tables or whether we want to go to the new Rothbarth. So, I guess I would probably need a little more time to reflect upon this. I do think that our analysis and your comments show that we're responsive to some of the input we've gotten in our listening sessions. For example, with regard to continuing to be concerned about low-income non-custodial parents, for example, certainly not the only one. So again, I personally look forward to hearing other people's comments and look forward to seeing how we converge upon a resolution. But again, your last point is noted, that there was less than a 15% change between the last tables and the new tables in most cases, right? Okay. Thank you.
Other comments from commission members?
Judge Key, if I may ask a question, I guess sort of piggybacking on what Dr. Tutterow just said. So I am not an economist by any means, but I think what I'm hearing is that the fact that Georgia's using an average of Engel and Rothbarth, with Engel now being, having problems with it and it's decreased. Is there a recommendation that we stop using it? I don't know where your role exactly starts and stops. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. But that's what I've got written down here with, stars next to it is, do we need to stop using Engel? If you're telling us as the expert, there are problems with it.
No, you do not. The problems with the Engel are with the new measurements of Engel. And part of that might be changes in the way that we consume out of home food expenditures. So the estimates that you have now are good. And if anything, you should walk away going, hey, maybe we're good. Most of these case examples came within 15%. Do we want to I mean, and that's always a question. Do we need to bother the legislature? And you're on the ground, you know what's going on. I'm only looking at it from an economic point of view and my ivory tower sort of thing, but you know where those cases are falling. And, the increases based on the pure economic data are suggesting that there should be some increases at high income. But we also know, and you know this from, having your boots on the ground, is that those high incomes are deviating. So, why take it to the legislature when they're deviating anyway? And then also, some of the amounts that where we're showing decreases are at the lower end, and you're contemplating doing a low income adjustment that might affect that anyway. So does the whole schedule or table, I can't get used to the term, most states use the term schedule. That's why you're on the commission, but the credibility of the existing table is very sound. The economic studies that underlie it, both the Betts and Rothbarth and the Betts and Engel, are good studies. They were the best studies out at that time. We are seeing a change in food trends, the way families spend food. And the Consumer Expenditure Survey has done some changes to their questions to accommodate that. The fact that that's happened since those data, were collected in 99, they made these changes, I think it was 2008 is one of those years. It does not mean that that existing schedule or table is invalid. It's still very, very credible. And I want to be absolutely clear on that.
Okay, I appreciate that. A follow-up question based on your answer there, if I may. Couple things, I think. So I would hesitate to just assume that because we're within the framework of what our current statute says, is a necessary threshold to modify, that we should just assume, therefore, we shouldn't modify our tables, because aren't we potentially kicking the can down the road till we get outside of that and then making a change where we would instigate a wave of modifications? Whereas if we make these adjustments now, and perhaps again in another, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. I mean, why wait until it's outside the threshold when we would be inviting modifications as opposed to adjusting all along? I mean, I almost liken it, and I apologize for anybody this offends if this seems like an extreme example, but it almost seems like, waiting until somebody gets hurt to change a rule that is, that clearly needs to be changed. And we're just waiting till somebody, actually breaks their arm, and then we're going to change the policy. And I wouldn't want us to wait until we exceed our, I'm looking at 19.6, 15K, in the modification thresholds. I wouldn't want to not make this adjustment because it doesn't exceed our threshold, when it would then, by waiting, we would then be inviting. I don't know if that makes sense, but I almost prefer the more incremental change so that we don't overwhelm our court system with a wave of modifications. I also think that sounds more fair to me, that for the children that are being supported in the interim. Like, sorry, kid, we knew you needed a little increase, but the increase wasn't big enough. So we had to wait till the next person. Like I said, that makes me feel like we're, waiting till someone actually gets hurt to change a regulation that we all can sort of see coming. So I'm not saying that we need to change. I'm just saying, if the thinking is don't change because it's not enough, I don't like the idea of waiting just until we exceed the threshold and then overwhelm our court system with modifications. I would rather see smaller changes, even if it's a pain for the legislature, but not then set us up for a wave of modifications. So to me, the fact that it's below the threshold actually is advantageous to making a change now, because then maybe the next time it would also be incremental, instead of making big changes down the road. The other thing I would comment on is just being a many years practitioner now in the Atlanta area, and knowing that and I know y'all survey different counties, and intentionally trying to capture the fact that it costs, cost of living is very different in different parts of Georgia. We're just one of those states that has, very rural areas, and then we've got our urban areas. I think increasing our the combined adjusted gross income on the basic child support obligation table to $40,000. I think that's appropriate. And I think in some ways it helps the families that live in the, 7 metro Atlanta counties that often feel like, you're not comparing apples to oranges, though I know y'all have done the work to do that. It's just often hard to explain that to a layperson. I understand and heard you that we're talking about 1% of cases. I'll tell you, it's a much, much, much larger percentage of my practice, because I practice right in the heart of Atlanta. So, so I see that in, I mean, the majority of my cases, frankly. And I feel like that could be a bit of an offset. And frankly, getting it to $40,000 doesn't even begin to cut it for my cases. Now, here again, I know that, and many, many, many other practitioners, by the way, I'm far from, but I like the idea of seeing that little bit of increase. To me, it does a little bit of offset for the people who feel like, why is my child support being calculated based on, what it's like to live in rural South Georgia when I live, in the city limits of Atlanta or close enough to it. So I think that's good for the way Georgia's population is clustered in our metro area.
Thank you, Katie. Dr. Venohr, do you want to speak to any of that before we go to other comments or questions?
I think that Ms. Connell demonstrates why you have a commission. She's got some valid points on, she's bringing it from the ground and what she's seeing. So, yeah, at the end of the day, it's a policy decision, and her voice, I'm sure, I could see Dr. Tutterow, he might have some comments, so.
Dr. Tutterow, do you want to have anything to say?
Sure, no, and again, I just want to make it perfectly clear. I'm not suggesting that we're kicking the can down the road. I am surprised, and perhaps Dr. Venohr is surprised, that the new version of the Engle performs so poorly. So if we throw it out and we go with Rothbard, we need to be clear that we're making a fundamental change about moving toward what we thought in 2006 was that time the lower estimate, but now it's the higher. So I just want us to make a conscious decision. The second part is, I agree with Katie. I support taking it to 40,000. In fact, if you look at federal tax forms, they'll tell you, up to this income level, here's the amount you pay, and then X% above that. And if you look at the implied tables, what they really are telling you, at least on the old ones, is you've got like a 2.8% marginal contribution beyond that cap. So I'm not even opposed to putting that down if you wanted. That's rather than saying, our data is only reliable in 40, but if you decide above 40, here's a reasonable number. You can explore that, but I have no problem taking it up to 40.
I love the idea of providing some guidance of what to do, or what the options are over and above what the BCSO table does. I think that would be fantastic for many, many, many Georgians.
Judge Williford.
Dr. Venohr, did I understand you to say that 2 of the 3 table options actually lower the basic child support obligation, not increase it? And that most states are keeping the existing amounts, recognizing that inflation has increased so much and is continuing to increase, that the last thing we want to do is lower the basic child support obligation in this economy?
I appreciate you summarizing, and it's just a little bit too broad.
Right.
Is I want to rein it in a little bit.
Right.
Is that we're seeing some decreases for the 1 child amount. And again, we might think that, and as I explained earlier, we think there might be a little bit of a sampling error, but for the 2 and 3 child amounts, if you were to stick with the average, and I appreciate Dr. Tutterow saying that this would be a switch to go from the average to the Rothbard. And I think he is much more, I've seen so many states switch that it's not so bothersome to me. And, and I think, but there are some decreases below about 5,000 and they're not big decreases like some of them. And so some states, like as I mentioned, I had a state that I ran the schedule in January and it shows some decreases for one pocket, usually at lower incomes. And then when I ran it again in July, there was so much inflation that decrease went away. So, I used July 2022 price levels. So if I was to run it today, let's see, the price levels for September won't be out until about the 13th of this month or of next month. It's probably going to look different, but I don't want to walk away to say that there's huge decreases in every part of the pocket. You really have to look at it. And that's that's the whole thing with, and look at the side by sides and sit there and study it. And that's an important thing because it's not things back in late 90s, when that data were collected from families have really changed, and then we know that they probably changed again since the pandemic. And unfortunately, we don't even have the data for 2020 yet. And it's going to be a little bit iffy with the consumer expenditure survey just because they had a low response rate. But that's the best data we have is 2013, 2019, which is the basis of both the Engel and the Rothbard, but it's not sweeping across the board decreases. Judge Williford, am I going off on a tangent there?
No, I understand. And of course, it doesn't address the parenting time issue that we're continuing to work on, that we probably won't have anything ready for the legislature until 2024, correct?
I don't know the years as far as the process.
But it doesn't address the parenting time issue.
No, that most states, with the exception of California, they layer the parenting time adjustment on top of the calculation. And the reason being is that not everybody gets parenting time.
Right.
And most states regulate it by requiring an order, either agreed to parenting time or an order. So obviously the never married are less likely to have that. There's some states that they require parenting education. Arizona, they have a time sharing adjustment that starts with, they just changed it. It used to start with like 1 overnight, and I think it's up to 20 overnights per year. And they require parenting education among divorcing cases, and they have a really good attendance, it's the vast majority of them. And I think that's it's a nice complement to a parenting time adjustment. So I'm kind of going off on a tangent there
No,
too.
I understand. I think I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
So what we're doing right now is comment and discussion around it with our next item on the agenda, more of action steps. So to structure this just a little bit right now, I'd like to hear from our judges and our justice, and then from our legislators, and then from other members of the commission. So if any other judges besides Judge Williford have anything you want to add, or Justice LaGrua add to this discussion, or have comments, questions?
Judge Key, this is Elaine. I just want to state very quickly that Justice LaGrua had to step away for just a moment, but she'll be back. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Other judges have comments or questions about the study?
I don't. I think we're on track. I haven't said a whole lot, but Katie and Judge Williford, I think you've touched on everything that, and I'm in the field every day because I do child support hearings for Superior Court here, a couple of days a month. So
Right.
I think we're on task.
Any other judges? What about our legislators? Anything you guys want to say, ask, comments?
I don't have anything on my end. I don't, Bonnie, I saw you were about to chime in too. I don't know, but I nothing on my end.
No, I don't have anything either. This was impressively thorough. Before being on this commission and practicing family law, I had no idea that there was this much that went into it. It's very impressive.
Right, thank you. Other members of the commission? Dr. Tutterow?
Sorry, I need education for me. If I'm a non-custodial parent paying child support, is there a threshold at which if my income goes up by a certain amount, the custodial parent automatically gets a hearing? So they have to ask.
Right.
Or is there a threshold that below which you cannot grant them a hearing on changing the amount? Okay, see, part of the problem, okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. That answers my question.
Right. Any other comments? A couple of things we haven't touched on. I'm trying to look around, see if anybody wants to talk. A couple of things we haven't touched on as part of this discussion. Let's talk a minute about the subsistence needs of the non-custodial parent through a low income deviation. We want to talk about that today, now. All right. Staff have anything you want to add to that piece? Elaine?
Noel.
I have a question for Dr. Tutterow based on her slide number 46, and I can bring it up if you'd like. Might
Yeah,
be
please
most.
do.
So Elaine and I went through this pretty thoroughly. I just want to clarify. Oops, sorry. First of all, is this for one child or two children? It might not even matter if I make my point. I just found it fascinating that even with a self-support reserve test, if we were using Georgia's deviation and a low-income deviation was granted in the case, the child support order for one child would be $100. Child support order for two children would be $150. This self-support reserve test would be higher than our current deviation, if I'm understanding this correctly. So even regardless of if this example is for one kid or two children, I just found it interesting that if our low-income deviation option was utilized, it would result in a lower child support amount than adopting the self-support reserve would have. That speaks to another question, which is different than how we account for it in calculating child support, is how the parameters and how we define when it gets applied. So anyway.
I want to compliment, if I may, am I okay to talk?
Yeah.
I want to compliment you for noticing that. And I will tell you a little bit more detail about Alabama. If you notice those incomes I selected, they're below full-time minimum wage earnings. If they had full-time minimum wage earnings, it would be $12.57 in each column. And that's where we saw a lot of the orders land in the DCSS and the 4D caseload in Georgia. And that's, and the same is true with Alabama. And Alabama, one of the things they were very concerned about was they did not want to see their order amounts decrease for minimum wage earners. So they did not want that self-support reserve to hit that area of the schedule. So it doesn't surprise me that what you say, that Alabama's deviation, and this is a presumption, it's not a deviation in Alabama, it's a presumptive, a rebuttable presumptive. Everything has to be a rebuttable presumptive under federal guidelines or federal rules, is that it doesn't surprise me that your low income calculation would be less for these, somebody with 1,200, 1,000. I'd encourage you to do the calculation using 1257, because to be honest, Alabama cases don't land here. They're also imputing a lot at 1257. And like Georgia, and I wouldn't compare Alabama's because it's a very low self-support reserve. I used it because this is what they adopted. It's a neighboring state. But if you really want to use something that's more updated, is probably more what modern, for lack of a better word, I would look at North Carolina. And even though North Carolina, they just met this year, so their schedule is based on 2018 data, it's still more modern than Alabama. This was a big deal for Alabama. They essentially had no low income adjustment, and they were working toward meeting that federal requirement. And I think this is a baby step, to be honest. It's arguable, what does somebody need at low income? But I applaud you for doing the calculation, but I will say that that's an unusual scenario for both Alabama and Georgia. I'd rather have you do 1257.
Right, so Elaine and Noel, if we touched everything on the discussion piece, I'm going to change the agenda just a little bit. Before we move to next steps, I was going to go ahead and do public comment. So we'll take that into account as we make decisions about next steps. But before I do that, if we touched all the comment points that you felt like we needed to touch?
Noel, do you think? I think we have. But Noel, was there anything else? And, you know what I need to say? Judge Williford had her hand up. I'm so sorry. I
Okay.
noticed that a moment ago.
I thought that was from before.
Yeah, it was. I've already
Oh,
spoken.
I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay. There was some discussion about talking about the 35 work hours per week and how that might apply. Do we need any further discussion around that?
I'm not sure. I mean, right now in our statute, we don't have a specific minimum wage amount or we took out the 40 hours so that we would comply with the final federal rule that came out at the end of 2016. So we're in compliance with that. I don't know, I don't know if we need to do anything further with that. Maybe that is sufficient, what we have in there, because it makes it flexible. One of the things that we do in training is that we tell people, be aware of what types of incomes you have in your community. Don't assume $7.25 an hour if everyone is being paid at $8.50 an hour at the minimum. Don't assume 40 hours a week if the highest time period there is 35 or 32, something like that. So that's what we encourage in training, and we hope that that's helping. But I know I've seen it in the case sampling where the Division of Child Support Services sometimes used less than 40 hours a week when they were imputing income, and even higher. I saw some at $10 an hour as opposed to $7.25, because that's what that wage was in that community. So I think that message is getting through, but I don't know, Noelle, do we need to continue any other conversation on the DOL and the 35? I know Jane brought that up during the August 19th presentation. Or
Right.
did Noelle, I guess to you first.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think our statute is robust in that it explains to folks to consider the 16 factors. It's no longer a bright line rule of imputing a federal minimum wage for 40 hours. That's just no longer the case. And I think the statute's very clear. Now it's a process of educating everybody that the statute has changed, that rule is no longer in place. And we actively do that at least monthly, but it's just getting the word out.
So Judge Palmer is one of the judges in my circuit. So Judge Palmer, good to see you. You shut up in your chair. Is that something you want to say or ask, or you just getting comfortable?
It's a lot of information to digest.
Yes.
Today was helpful. I think that I was, like Noelle said, I was a little surprised that, our low income deviation calculation would be lower than the one that, at least compared to Alabama. I mean, she clarified that a little bit.
All right, thanks.
I mean, I've spent more time on the low income issue, I really kind of want to digest this a little more before I decide what I'd be in favor of.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get to next steps, and the next step there may be not taking a next step, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. Any comment from any commission members or staff? So whoever's driving Zoom, do we have some folks who want to make public comment?
We do.
Yes. I have on my list that we have Charles Langevin, and I apologize if I am mispronouncing the last name. And let's see, I need to go over he was the first one who indicated he wanted to speak. So I'm going to promote him to panelist to be able to do that for us.
Are we going to do 3 minutes? Is that enough?
And then Noelle, you'll have to unpromote him, I think, afterward.
Yes.
Is there another way that we can do that, Noelle?
I'll do it. And we also have another person in the queue. So yeah, I think.
Right. Other than the one that just popped up, I have Paul Harper after him. And then I guess Mr. Freeman.
So we have 3 at the moment, Judge.
Yes, correct.
Let's try to do 3 minutes each if you can, stay as close as you can to that. So
okay.
Who did you say is going first?
Charles.
All right, Charles, will you, if you're unmuted, will you tell us what you want to tell us?
Noel, do we have to promote him to panelist?
I did. Mr.
Oh, you
Langman, just
did.
unmute
Okay, thank
yourself
you.
and you may speak. I'll handle it, Elaine.
Okay, thank you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. It kind of spun for a second before
Right.
it let me be a panelist. So,
Go ahead.
good afternoon. My name is Charles Longeman. I'm the executive director and the registered lobbyist for Georgia Parents for Kids' Rights. Our mission is to provide children equal or approximately equal access to both parents. Nearly all the recent research indicates that this is the second most ideal situation for children to be in after living in a two-parent household. In lobbying for House Bill 96 and House Bill 1140 in the previous session, the roadblocks we always hit were one, judges who didn't want to lose accountability or power. Number two, attorneys that didn't want to give up billable hours. And three, child support. It's because of the third objection that I appear before you today. Given the level of pushback that I've received in attempting to advance the policy that is undisputably in the children's best interest, I learned that if something doesn't make sense, it must make dollars for someone. My time is limited, so I'm going to address some of my concerns in the form of several questions. If they need to be repeated or explained, I'm happy to do so at the end. I've not had an opportunity to review the current economic impact study, but I did dissect the one that Dr. Venohr did in 2018. In 2018, the study showed that the average custodial parent earned $1,540 per month in gross wages. Interestingly enough, this is the amount that maximized the earned income tax credit that year. The non-custodial parent earned a total of $2,515. This seemed to be the end of the inquiry. We calculated those numbers assuming 2 children and discovered that after taxes, tax credits, and the presumptive child support amount, the custodial parent netted $2,781.63, and the non-custodial earned only $1,367.26. To put that in perspective, according to Rent Cafe, the median rent in Atlanta is $1,861 per month, and only 4% of apartments rent for less than $1,000 per month. I want to know, was any of this studied under the current economic impact study? And as you all probably know, the Child Support Enforcement Agency's tools in collecting child support are wage garnishments, which we have evidence that employers are directed to take up to 65% of after tax but before insurance earnings, driver's license and professional license suspensions, and incarceration. That leads to a new set of questions. What is the cost to taxpayers of incarcerating indigent people made indigent by these guidelines? What is the cost to taxpayers of caring for people made homeless by these guidelines? Because obviously, if you're only getting $1,300, you can't afford $1,000 a month in rent. What's the cost to motorists for driving in a state with numerous uninsured motorists due to license suspensions stemming from the guidelines? What is the economic impact to supply chain issues when truck drivers are unable to earn a living thanks to the guidelines? What's the economic impact of professionals unable to provide goods and services as a result of license suspensions stemming from unaffordable guidelines? What are non-custodial parents doing to make ends meet? We actually did some studies on that. What is the economic impact of both parents minimizing their income as a result of both the tax code along with the guidelines? What's the impact of these parents working under the table jobs and not paying taxes? That tended to be something that we heard a lot. What is the economic impact of illegal activities that are engaged in as a means of survival for non-custodial parents? Obviously, that's an under the table occupation. What is the economic impact of the non-custodial parent quitting their job because the transportation to work exceeds the 35% of their income that they're allowed to keep?
Mr. Langevin, you're at 4 minutes. Could you wrap up, please?
Yes, sir. Give me just 2 more points. I heard a lot of talk about the inflation we all know is going on, but it seems like the inflationary measures equally affect both the custodial and non-custodial households. Why would we not factor in the impact to non-custodial parent? And lastly, and most importantly, what is the economic impact created by the abundance of criminals, mass shooters, drug users, and all other ills we know are created by children that were raised without their father because the father cannot afford to hire an attorney to fight for custody after being put in this child support situation?
All right,
Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Who is next, Nicole?
I believe it's Mr.
Noel,
Harper.
Noel, apologize.
No worries. It's okay. I believe it's Mr. Harper, and if you
That-
give me just a
Yes,
second.
correct, Paul Harper.
All right, your time has started, Mr. Harper. Thank you.
Hold on just 1 second. Let me get him over here.
I'll stop and restart.
Okay, should be momentarily.
Right.
Mr. Harper, if you're prompted on your screen to change your setting, please accept that. Here he comes.
Here he is.
Mr. Harper?
Mr. Harper, you'll need to unmute.
Okay, yes, there we go.
Here you are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, yeah, just thanks very much to the Commission and for all the work, and Dr. Venohr, all your efforts. So it all is greatly appreciated. Just two questions that I have. One, so, and maybe just, with regards to Charles Langview's position, I too would absolutely support that parents having equal time or near equal time is the best outcome for children, and I can see that. So, and I'm talking about healthy children. So I would really encourage, that sort of adoption. My two questions is, one, what are we moving towards what I would call mandatory parenting time deviation? So where there's less flexibility around or this being optional for a judge to decide, and more definitive where it is simply a matter of imputing something in the spreadsheet. So that would be my first question. And then secondly, I have been involved in these discussions for almost going on 4 years. So, and what I would like to encourage, if at all possible, is if we could try and get these changes included in any of the upcoming legislative season. It feels that, if we're trying to be responsive to the needs of the population on both sides, so, it feels like if we could try and expedite it or be a little bit more proactive, that would be greatly appreciated. I know these issues are complex, and I know that this commission does fantastic work, but it does feel like we should be able to kind of get things moving a little bit quicker, and so that would be my second request.
All right, thank you, Mr. Harper. I can report that we're moving pretty quickly on one thing, and that is Regina reports that she's reached Senator Strickland, who will move forward with a resolution to create a study committee in the Senate. So that's a pretty significant step. Thank you, Regina, for that. All right, thank you, Mr. Harper, for your comment. Noel?
And Noel, Mr. Freeman has now withdrawn his request to speak. But we do have a message from Carol Walker. Noel, can you see that, or do you want me to read it?
I can.
Okay.
So Carol Walker, who was previously on our Parenting Time Deviation Study Committee, says, please discuss and comment on the idea that Georgia should not update the tables now because there is not yet a 15% adjustment, or take that to mean recommended change in the table. These tables have not been updated for 17 years and should be updated. It's time. And I do agree with the concept that there should be some guidance for over $40,000 income. I also question the idea that we should not consider a self-support reserve for the custodial parents.
So that's actually, if we're finished with comment, that's a good segue into the action items. Thank you for that, Ms. Walker. As we move into action items, the kind of the first thing to talk about is whether the commission wants to bring a bill for the 2023 legislative session to amend the statute with an updated table as recommended by Dr. Venohr. We believe there's time to do that if the decision is made and made soon. So to the commission members, is there an appetite to move forward with new tables? Both the new numbers on the tables and also going up to the $40,000. Katie Ms. Connell seems to be nodding.
Yes, I have an appetite for that. To Judge Williford's point earlier, I'm concerned about the idea that any version of this would lower the child support at any level. I'm not sure really how to reconcile that, where it then at other income levels increases. But I certainly I support the idea of increasing the total amount of gross income accounted for in our basic child support obligation to $40,000. per year or per month gross. I also think we should update our tables. As Carol Walker pointed out, it's been 17 years. Though, as Judge Williford, if I understood her correctly, was expressing some concern about, I am troubled by the idea that it would lower available support for any of Georgia's children, even if it's only one in a certain income bracket. So I'm not sure exactly how to reconcile those two things, but I think we need to consider updating our tables. If nothing else, I don't like the idea of Georgians thinking that we have 17-year-old tables that haven't been adjusted, because even a layperson would think that the economy has changed, the world has changed in 17 years, and it just feels out of date.
So Elaine and Noel, the way I'm thinking I'm going to handle this, but if it makes sense, is I think we'll need a motion and a second and a vote to move forward with this. And I know Dr. Tutterow said he still needs some time to study the report some more. And if there's a vote to move forward with the tables this year, would it be appropriate to send that to Economic Subcommittee to come back with something more specific?
Judge Key, can I make a comment real quick?
So who is that? I'm sorry, who that is.
Sean,
Absolutely, Justice Brewer.
I'm not weighing in either way. I would just strongly urge that if we're going to consider this, the committee speak to Regina Quick and Bonnie Rich about potential implications for opening the statute up to other things, which is always a concern when you propose legislation. And they're the experts in that arena. I'm not, but I have seen bills hijacked for all kinds of reasons, and that's always a risk. So I think we should just use our legislative folks that know that process so well as a sounding board before we do something like that. Sorry, Regina, putting you on the spot. Same to you, Bonnie.
Yeah, I think that's great. My point is that if there's an appetite to move forward, we need to make some decisions about exactly what it's going to look like to know about that, and that could impact the positions of our legislators and of Regina.
Question I have, if I can,
Sure.
Try to say much, but the justice makes a point, and another one. One, if you're going to go, this will probably not happen in a year. It'll be a 2-year cycle. We're beginning a new 2-year cycle. The legislators know this, and it will be something that would be probably fleshed out. It's not to say that you couldn't put in a bill next year, but if it goes probably something this substantive, you might be looking at 2 years back out. But along with that, I think it really needs to be, and Dr. Tutterow has mentioned this, it really needs to be pretty focused and well thought out with pretty defined parameters. One, to try to avoid what Justice LaGrue was just saying, but two, to create as minimum of confusion that we can and make the bullet points simple, understandable, and as focused. Nothing more frustrating than a legislator to get a bill that looks broad or so broad and covering so many areas that it's causes confusion, and the weight of it just bogs it down as we move through. So that was a bit of a way of saying, and I'm not trying to put either Roger or anybody else on that economic side. Is there time between now and January, and legislators to put a focused, tightly drawn as we can? Obviously, things will change, evolve, be amended, substituted, hopefully not to the underlying damage of what this commission wants to try to achieve. But is that time to put together the kind of quality product that would be ready to go in January, that we could all defend, understand, and help in the process?
Anybody want to speak to that? I think he was asking Dr. Tutterow, you or anyone else thinks that that's enough time to do the job and do it right.
Well, we will have an economic study committee meeting on the 19th. Hopefully everyone will have time to look at this analysis and reflect upon it and see if we can reach some common agreement. Again, ultimately, it is the decision of the commission. So anything coming out of the economic study committee would be strictly a recommendation. But I mean, I try to do things on first principles. And if we're going to look at migrating toward the Rothbard type methodology solely, that's fine if we make that decision. But then that's kind of what needs to guide things, if that's the decision we make.
Judge Key, I very much agree with what Chuck Clay said. I mean, there are a few different things here. There's what methodology do we use? There's the low income issue, the equal parenting time thing is looming out there. And I spent probably an hour and a half looking at the material Elaine sent out before the meeting today, and I've sat through this meeting, and I still don't feel like I really have a good grasp of it all. So I'm not saying we don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I would want to understand precisely what we want to do and how we're going to do that before we start working.
You could also maybe break it into smaller pieces.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that if there is areas that we all can agree on that we think could go, but your point is very valid. All those issues will come up no matter what we introduce.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess one question, and I think that was what was raised a few minutes ago, and legislators and Regina can speak to it better than I can. It didn't occur to me that we could be going to the legislature 2 years in a row with issues out of the commission, and whether there's an appetite.
That doesn't mean we don't start working on it.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right. So
well, that was my concern, Judge Key, was that if we, and I'm not saying Katie's wrong. I think after 17 years, maybe clearly we need to take a strong look at what changes need to be made. And the way I see the notes, at least all three of the new table options increase the high income to 40,000. So I mean that's almost a no-brainer, I would say. But do you go to the legislature with those? And I know they're not small things to some people, but that one issue or a couple of issues, when we have these huge issues that we need to talk about with the low income deviation that we're working on, with the parenting time adjustment that we're working on, and certainly Dr. Tutterow and his committee need more time to advise us on what they think we need to do in terms of which one of these methodologies or table options we need to choose. And so maybe there's not enough time to put all this together and have a real concise idea of how we want the child support statute changed to have it ready for 2023. I don't know enough about the legislative process to know, do you just put forward this one thing and the next year another thing and the next year another thing, or would it be better to come with a more complete package of these changes and present it in one big bill, or do we piecemeal it? But that to me would be very important to understand, I guess, the process better, and which way would be the best way to go with it. One little thing at a time, or a whole complete package of things that we've been working on that we need to get resolved.
I can know it, having been there at the time when all this was being done at the General Assembly. It took us about 6 years for the subject to be arised to come to the statutory framework that we've created today. I'm not saying for a minute I think we've crossed many of the rivers that were being debated back then. But I just want to be able to. I don't want to put in something that's being fleshed out as we go. That is not a good recipe for success. But again, I'm not an expert. Some of the practicing lawyers who are in this arena know this much better than I would. But those are just things to consider, from a sort of a legislative, strategic, or even tactical side of moving forward.
It would seem to me that even though there's an appetite on this commission for certainly changing some things, that there's really nothing, there's not an action item before the commission today. I would think that the chair of our statute review committee and the chair of economic subcommittee could work together with staff to see if there's anything that needs to be brought to the commission around these areas, includes also, it's another item on my list, but that the low income deviation is not ready to move forward either. So I think where we are is let our statute review committee, our low income deviation committee, our parenting, our shared parenting folks, and all the groups have been doing such good work so far, try to get on the same page with something. If it's something that needs to move forward, you can bring it back to the commission. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. A couple of things we need to do is, one is voting on the approval for We need to do that. We need to motion to add Dr. Venohr's new contract, right? Is that right, Elaine?
Yes,
No,
sir.
Tell me
Yes, sir.
specifically what that motion is.
It does a member need to bring that motion?
I'm guessing if you tell us what it is, some members gonna move to do that.
Okay,
So I'm
so, and this may be of interest, especially to Judge Williford. This would be a motion for us to create a contract, enter into a contract through the AOC with Dr. Venohr for her to help us, to lead us through the process of the parenting time deviation. There'll be some other components of that, including legitimation, Judge Key, which I know you have a particular interest in. Lots of people do right now. We also were going to include low income in that. Noelle and I have worked on a very draft version of the deliverables for that contract. We've not yet spoken with Dr. Venohr about cost and time frame, but she has already agreed with us that she could enter into a contract. So that would be the purpose of that. So the AOC would be able to move forward with creating that contract with Dr. Venohr.
And we have the funding for that.
Yes, sir. We can take care of that.
Did anyone so move?
All right, I'll move to add Dr. Venohr's Dr. Venohr's new contract, the redevelopment of a low income deviation in addition to parenting time.
Second.
That was Chuck Clay, I think. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? It carries. Are there any other votes we need today, Elaine or Noelle?
No, sir, I don't believe so. I do want to point out that I realized after we had finished public comment that we had one more person who had his hand raised. And I don't know, we're already beyond our time period, Vernon Days. So Judge, I don't know if there's an opportunity for taking another public comment, or he could appear on November 4th to make that comment.
Does anyone object to taking 3 more minutes for this?
No.
Let's let him in.
Yep.
Then I have a 1 minute comment after that, and we'll be done.
We actually had two further. We had Mr. Days and then also a Raja Anto.
Right, I just see that one too as well, Noelle.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Days can be coming over momentarily. Mr. Days, if you just unmute yourself, then you'll be, there he goes.
Right. Go ahead, sir.
First of all, I want to appreciate you for taking my time. I wanted to pose a question about a specific deviation in the terms of for the dependent care credit. This seems like a deviation that would occur in a majority of child support cases. And I was just wondering if the thought has been to throw it out there to move that to kind of a part of the calculator as opposed to a deviation.
I think that's a question and not a comment on a pending matter before the commission, it sounds like. But you could probably address that question to staff in an email. They could answer it for you probably.
Okay.
And Judge, I didn't understand his topic. I apologize, but I don't know if the connection is not very good. What was his subject matter?
So I was speaking on the standard, the specific deviation of the dependent care credit. Right now it is.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Just reach out directly to staff.
Okay, thank you, sir.
On that. And very quickly, the other remaining comment, I'm sorry we didn't see you when we were doing public comment. Noelle, can you get the other person?
Yeah. Yeah, and in terms of his question, it's something that we could raise perhaps at statute review, because I'm just, anyway, we'll handle that one.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, just 1 second. And this is Raja Antone, calling him for his public comment.
Hello.
Hello.
No, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Sorry. Hey, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I actually could have waited. So I don't mind waiting if you need me to. But so just raise your hand if you want me to judge. Listen, hey, well, okay, so you're smiling, so I'll talk. Hey, listen. So here's my I've been attending all of the meetings. I do really like. How intentional the committees seem to be. And I like collectively what Georgia is trying to do. My issues are still more with some of the real life tactical implications that I just don't quite see those things being addressed either upfront or either downstream, right? So just at a high level, and I really will be done very quickly. I really, and I mentioned this to Elaine last week, Elaine Noel, I really want to see a good conversation about child support, about the impacts on non-custodial parents, especially during the summers. That's when that non-custodial parent I hear the conversations today, like the gentleman mentioned about he made the example about how the incomes and how the money, how it is at a disparate level when you add in all the credits and all these other things. That really is something that we really need to take a look at. We still don't get, you've heard us mention this before, we don't get that 1/3. As non-custodial parents, we don't get that 1/3, but we still pay that 2/3.
You're cutting out badly.
As I move along quickly, I
I'm
think,
sorry.
Judge,
Yeah,
I
you
should wait
can-
until next month.
Yeah,
It'll be
thank
done.
you. You're cutting out, so just if you don't mind, wait till the next meeting, okay? Thank you so much.
Yeah, because I don't want you to miss a word.
Thank you.
Just by way of information, to see if there's any objection by any member of the commission, we talked a lot about legitimation, making it easier for a child to be legitimated in Georgia. There is likely something coming forward this year, either out of DHS or out of the governor's office around that. And I would like to be able, on behalf of the commission, just to send something to the governor's office, let them know if they're looking at something without knowing specifically what it is, that the commission is generally in favor of making it easier for children to be legitimated in Georgia. Is there any opposition to that?
Nope.
It could help that move forward. All right. I don't think we need to vote on it. I just didn't want to do if there's any opposition.